Hi there, my name is Corey Johnston.
And I'm Michelle Maunder.
And you are listening to Spirited Conversations, engaging and elevating pediatric occupational therapists, a joint collaboration between SEED Pediatric Services and Developmental FX. Each week, you'll hear from myself and Michelle as we nerd out with Tracy Stackhouse. Just a note before we start, Spirited Conversations is for informational purposes only. We're not intending to be a substitute for professional medical advice or therapeutic intervention. We urge you to seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health professionals with any questions you have regarding specific medical conditions. With that, let's jump into today's episode. Hello, welcome back. Episode 5. Here we are. Hi, Tracy. Hi, Michelle. How are you guys?
Good, Corey. Hello, Trace. How are you?
Hey, I'm so good. Great to be back again, you guys, and ready to have another fun conversation with you.
Yes, we're going to jump into modulation. We started to talk about it a little bit at the end of the last episode. And I just want to let everybody know this is such a big topic. And it was really confusing for me initially when I started learning about it. And so be okay with the process. It might not all make sense. I'm still learning about this 7 years in. And you know, it'll come to you as it comes to you, and as you pull this stuff together, just keep coming at it. And that's kind of fun. This process kind of lets us do that. This conversation, you can be part of this conversation.
And I think every time you talk about it, you add another little piece to it. Or so, yeah, I don't think we'll ever be done. And the science is moving so fast that we're not going to shut the file on this. We're going to keep coming at modulation and kids and how it gets impacted.
Yes, for sure.
Continually.
Yes. So I'm going to sort of put together my words around this concept, and I know that the way I've put it together is probably more basic than it actually is, but that will give us sort of a way to talk about it maybe from there. And we can then refine that. So when I think about sensory modulation, I always think about, I actually go back to my initial traffic jam in the brain in like volume dial. And I know that Jen Jareb was the first person to sort of introduce me to that concept. So I always think about the nervous system's ability to either, and I say turn the volume up or enhance certain inputs, or its ability to turn the volume down or dampen or quiet, sort of, I guess quiet's not the right word, but sort of reduce other inputs. And that function then allows the nervous system to organize and pay attention to, I want to say what's important, but that is a very dicey word, because if the brain is in a different state, different things are important. So I guess to be able to dial that up and dial that down to match the situation or the environment. So that's kind of how I've put it together. But there's so much to that. So
Corey, that's how I think about it as well. Probably from Jen Jareb as well. I think that's how I explain it to families and educators. So I think that is how I started with that language, and it still is a really accessible way for parents and kids to understand that for themselves. Yeah.
So I guess for me, it's now, well, what's the mechanisms behind that? And because it's complicated, like the brain's ability to do that is complicated, and so I guess understanding the how or the why, how that gets organized will then allow you to be able to intervene or to support the function itself, or to know when it's getting disrupted as well. So, and to piece that out from everything else that might be disrupting it. Like if you're just thinking about, if I said, the child's ability to match the environment or the demand, then you have to be able to separate whether that's a modulation issue or whether it's a postural issue, or you know, there's so many potential ways that the child might not be able to match the demand in front of them. So let's talk about modulation. What do you think, Tracy?
I love it, you guys. So here's the thing, starting with that basic concept of dialing up and dialing down. is a great place to start. But then the brain isn't one single dial. So maybe the first place to remember, or to start to not remember, but to shift into, is to say that if you're trying to dial in to paying attention maybe to our voices right now, or to a teacher's voice in a classroom, or to my friend's voice that I'm playing with on the playground, what that means is that you're actually dialing up their voice while you're dialing down the sense of hunger that you have because you haven't eaten lunch yet, or you're dialing down the feeling of your clothes on your body because they were itching you. And so the brain is doing this simultaneous dialing up and dialing down of multiple functions. And when it's doing that, the more that it is working hard at that, then the brain is actually having to dial in and dialing down the fact that it's dialing in and dialing down, which is sort of like deep and hard to explain. Because it's the salient things like attention and language and processing of other things, but it's also dialing in and dialing down the fact that it's dialing in and dialing down. So that's actually what modulation is it's the deeper, what state should we be in right now? So sometimes we use that word state as kind of a descriptor of the regulatory, how you're showing up, how you're present in the world. So when I say the word state, we're going to connect sensory modulation and the word state together. And that is a big leap. That's a leap of neurological faith, basically, that there's a connection there. So when I say the word state, what does that mean to you guys in relation to sensory modulation?
I think about it in terms of state of regulation. So I probably use those words. So I'm guessing that's what you're meaning when you say state, Tracy. So your state of regulation, which is, I'll use the words that I use to explain this to families, I guess, before we get all neurological, is that I explain it like a car will have an engine speed or a basic engine idle speed. So a Ferrari will have, when it's idling, it'll be revving and its capacity will be for more intensity, more power, and it's got I'll probably say that. And then that other cars like a Toyota Corolla. Are we allowed to advertise on this show? Or a Mazda 5 is actually my car preference.
We have no sponsors.
That its idle speed is lower than a Ferrari. So I guess that bodies are the same, that we have this idle speed state and that it can change so that we can change our state according to what we're required to do internally, but also externally, the environment, so that I'm going from a base idle speed and then I will, I don't want to say amp, but I will move my state up when I'm about to do a podcast. And then when I'm in the middle of a podcast, I might put my gears down. So I'm in gear 1 and I'm ready to pay attention and really think about what I'm doing here now.
Yeah. I have a very similar thought about it. I don't always use the car analogy, but I do think that's a really helpful way to think about it, just because you can push a pedal down and increase speed. And in some ways that feels somehow similar to the ability of the nervous system to either, and I always say ramp up, either increase the arousal or the state of the nervous system where there's more activity, more energy. I guess I always refer to as it being more heightened.
And a readiness, there's a readiness.
Yeah, and I'm not even thinking about where you've gone too far yet. I'm just thinking about your ability just during the day to either shift and match your own state. And I'm trying to put words around what the state is, but I guess it depends on the internal feeling, like whether you're feeling more engaged, whether you're feeling more slow or tired. So I guess I think about state as just the reflection of the nervous system and its ability to match the actual environment. So if I need to be able to read, then I can't be too revved up. I need to be able to shift my state down. And, you know, for me, that might be, if I've got a lot of energy, I might need to go and do like 10 big bounces on the lounge room or something. And then I'm
bounces,
like,
you need to do burpees.
Yeah, like something, or like I don't know, you guys don't know this term, but like a pike in cheerleading where you jump up and you touch your toes in front of you. Like, you know, I might need to do like 10 of them. And then I'm like, okay, whew, now I feel like I'm ready to go, and then I can settle into the pillows. But, you know, that's just me because like you said, my baseline is probably very different to other people's, where they sit, their idle speed or their normal state, their
base state
base
level.
state is different to where mine is. So I don't know, Tracy.
And I got that from, I think that's Dan Siegel's and maybe Pat Ogden's, is it? I think that's that model of modulation. And I think people talk about it in different
That's the other
ways.
thing I was going to say. There's so many different terms for the same thing,
Yeah.
it feels like.
Yeah, so what we did was we sort of danced from the first words we said were sensory modulation. Then we said the word state, and we connected state to the window of tolerance, or this arousal theory. So what we're talking about here is that state in relation to arousal is that idle speed. When you are ready to go, whatever the ready is, that you bring to it a certain energy. And that energy has a quality of activation to deactivation to it that's really individually different based on our personality and our temperament. But it's also really based on the environment and the relationships and the context. So if you needed to go drive on a super challenging, bumpy, skinny mountain road, you wouldn't choose the fast, fancy car, because you'd be more dangerous, right? So if you could go out into a parking lot and choose any vehicle, they're all going to idle at different speeds and they're all going to have different capacities to them. And we match our safety to and our experience and our adventureness to the possibility. And so that's really kind of what arousal and the window of tolerance are all about. And sensory modulation is one source of the dialing up and the dialing down of that. So if you only have a really fast car, but you have to drive on a scary road, you can use your brake a lot. You can put it in a low gear. You can control those factors in a lot of different ways if you know how to regulate the car. So if you know how to regulate your system, your brain, you can manage lots of different scenarios. But what happens with sensory modulation problems is that it limits those control factors. So if your little nervous system doesn't manage this stuff well, then you actually don't know how to use the brake very well, or you don't know how to use the accelerator very well, or you only have it full on and full off. You don't really have the ability to manage it and grade it and control it. So that's one critical component of when we talk about state. It's the kind of, what is my resting idleness? And then what's my ability to ramp up or ramp down, push the brake or push the go? And how do I go between those places? So that's one element that's so important.
So
Love it.
But
oh, sorry, you go, Tracy. I was just going to
We've
quickly...
had a brain explosion.
Yeah. I was going to question, because I realized when we first were talking, when you asked us, like, how do we put this state and sensory modulation together, that I realized I didn't answer the sensory modulation aspect of the question, but that you did it beautifully. But so I'm just thinking about, in terms of the ramping up and the ramping down, we then, as occupational therapists, think about how sensory inputs support the ramping up or the ramping down. And is that how state and sensory modulation come together? Is that the fact that, like you said, that the sensory modulation piece is so critical to state because input shifts the nervous system's ability to go up or down? Like I know there's
or vice versa.
Or
vice versa, that if you're not shifting sensory input, you can't adjust your modulation.
You mean if you're not integrating sensory input, then you can't modulate your state. And I know that it's more complicated than just sensory modulation. Like it's not just sensory input that shifts state, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the other thing that the sensory modulation function, and it actually draws from detail. So it's drawing out of sensory discrimination. But the sensory modulation function, it also tells you when you get into the car to go, when you enter an experience, when you enter an interaction, is your seatbelt on? Do you feel snug? Do you feel secure? Do you feel bounded by space? Do you feel a sense of I'm here and I've arrived and I'm present and I'm safe? And if you meet those factors, if the answer to those questions is yes, here you are, yes, you're safe, yes, you can engage, then it can dial up and dial down. So the sensory modulation function tells you, am I safe or not? Am I engageable or not? If the answer is yes, then proceed with the go or the no-go. But if the answer is no, then it tells you, you actually don't have the freedom to go here. You don't have the freedom to start and stop. And we're going to start making those decisions for you because we have to protect you and we have to keep you safe. So sensory modulation informs the go, no go of the modulation circuitry. But the very first question that it answers is the safety question.
So is that through limbic? So the sensory input coming in through, is it the reticular? So I know some people might not know these terms, but take it as you like it, and you can ignore these terms if you don't want to know anything about them. But is that through the reticular activating system up into the limbic system, into the immediate, is that how that's happening? Or how is...
Well, then to the prefrontal cortex, is there still a bit of cortex involvement too?
Yeah, how's that happening? So information, input's coming into the nervous system, and then it's getting evaluated somehow for threat or safety, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the first key word there is evaluated. The information is getting evaluated. Yeah. And it's getting evaluated first for, is this a good thing or not a good thing? Is this a soft, touchy thing that I want to experience, or is this a threatening, spiky thing that I don't want to experience? So on the first level, that's a sensory question. Right away, then it gets processed. If the answer is this isn't safe, then what happens is there's a mobilization across the circuitry. It actually starts in the reflex arcs, not even in the brain. It happens all the way down in the body, where you are turned on to be faster, move away from, withdraw, have a reflex that withdraws from the touching of the hot thing or the spiky thing or the uncomfortable thing. So it'll mobilize your phasic muscle activation and move you away from the source of threat. And then in your brain, it'll mobilize the activations and energies that'll protect you. So it moves through the reticular, the activating systems, the arousal systems. But right away, it's going to start to interact with the diencephalon, these deep circuits in the brain that are related to the autonomic nervous system. And that autonomic activation is going to shift you more out of engagement and into protection. It's going to activate that fear, fight, or flight responding. If the threat is really significant, like if the thing that you saw or touched or engaged with on a sensory level was a really humongous threat, it might freeze you or shut you off or shut you down. So you're going to get this mobilization or demobilization in the autonomic nervous system. And then you're going to also have this emotional response. And that emotionality is going to recruit then the social circuitry that'll make you wonder about, is there a person here to keep me safe? What would my mom do in this situation? Who else can I invoke and think about to help me problem solve? So right away, the social brain and then the prefrontal cortex will also start to be involved in terms of problem solving. But that's a cascade, right? Up this hierarchy of layers of nervous system. So none of it, and that all kind of happens a little bit parallel and a little bit sequentially. Yeah, it's super complicated. So look at that. We went from the peripheral all the way through the central nervous system. And we're talking both about sensory processing as well as arousal processing, emotional processing, autonomic processing, social, like it's big. So that's why when we say the word state, it's not one thing, it's humongous. So here we did this kind of quick review of how we go from sensory modulation into all of this state, the neural circuitry of state. And it's so big. So I'm wondering what questions that brings up for you guys.
When we did that dance across, I have trying to get my head around all of this, read different authors, Tracy. And so I guess there's a whole lot of different languages and concepts about different elements. And what we know is that the brain is really integrated. And I think traditionally we have thought of the brain being in different parts, like there's this idea of the Truon brain or the hierarchy of the brain, and then senses. Like it's easy in thinking about this that we tease it all apart and we put it together a bit like a Lego box, but the brain doesn't work like that. I guess it's much more fluid and integrated. So I wonder, in the pulling apart of the brain, the ideas that you just raised then about the body's feeling of safety and not. I know Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory talks about neuroception. So when you were mentioning that the senses evaluate whether they're safe or not. So is that the same language or concept that Porges is talking about with neuroception? And that cascade that you talked about going up, and then if it's identified or evaluated to be stressful, a threat, that you have that cascade of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic activation, and the mobilization. So that sounds like the polyvagal theory, neuroception, and the theory. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So here's where there's kind of an interesting and important layering of information, and also a little bit of a disconnect. And that is that in the traditional, not so much the Ayers sensory integration theory, because Dr. Ayers defined sensory modulation as the ability of the nervous system to maintain harmony across all of these functions from a sensory foundation.
I've just got goosebumps. Yeah. It's so lovely.
It is so
it's
lovely.
So neurologically correct, but it's kind of lovely. Harmony's lovely.
It is. It's cool, right? And so in that, it's this ability of the nervous system to do all what we started to talk about at the very beginning, that there's lots of dials. There's not one. Mm-hmm. And those dials are all responding to keeping the person in a state of adaptation. The foundation of adaptation is neuroception. So Porges' concept of neuroception is that you have the nervous system's ability on a sensory, interoceptive, very deep level, being able to discern, is something safe or not? if there's safety or protection available. And if you're in a state of threat, that you're going to relatively then either dial up or dial down, activate or deactivate. So the neuroception is this double valenced function of safety threat versus activation deactivation. So that concept of a double valence is critically important. And actually, even though it's a Porges concept and not everyone in the world talks about it from a Porges viewpoint, from a really classic neuroscience perspective, we know those two valences exist at the level of every single cell, through the whole system, and into the whole way that the brain produces behavior. So we have neuroception as a base. But in the OT literature, there's been this funny disconnect, because not from an errors perspective, but in kind of this sensory processing literature that's abundant, there's this discussion about how things are either under or over responsive, or over hypo or hyper responding. And that became this kind of linear continuum where you're either under or over, but it doesn't interact with that valence that's double. So under and over is not a very helpful concept. And actually, in the new sensory integration theory and practice textbooks, there's really a movement away from this simple linear continuum, which I've been waiting for a couple of decades. So I'm really excited.
And so that it better aligns with the actual neuroscience, biology.
The mechanism, right? So that was my question, actually. Yeah, well, it was my question because when you were talking about the child that sticks their hand on the spiky thing, and I know that that's part of that reflex arc, but I was thinking about, what about those kids then when it's not spiky, but they react as if what they were touching is that spiky thing? And so that I guess that's a modulation function, but you kind of just talked about it then. And it traditionally people would say, well, they're over responders, but there's instances where that child won't react in that way. And so that makes so much sense, because if they're, say, if they're on that second valence where they're more activated into threat, then they might react more to that potential input than they would if they're in the state of safety. So that's why it makes so much more sense where you might get this inability to tolerate certain things amped up if you're in a perceived threat state.
Tracy, just when we're kind of refining all the literature, so I think I already said that Pat Ogden and Dan Siegel are already involved in this as well with the modulation model, or the window of tolerance. So that kind of looks a little bit different, but seems to align to this as well. I'm wondering about the concept of arousal. Because for me, is that the same as state? Are those words used interchangeably, or is arousal a little bit more like reactivity at a cellular and neuronal level? Like, how can we define that term? And is it the same and used interchangeably in the neuroscience to alertness or state?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and honestly, this is kind of funny, but for almost a year and a half, I've been working on a big science paper that I'm writing with several other people. And one of the problems has been that we can't come to enough consensus about what is arousal. And because depending on where you read it and what it's actually quite a complicated question you're asking. So what happens in our OT literature, our dear colleagues, Mary Sue Williams and Sherry Schellenberger, put together this engine speed alert model way back in the 1990s, and it's used all over the world with a lot of efficacy. And it uses this simple metaphor of a car engine. So we're sort of back to the beginning of our episode today, talking about the car engine, with the idea of your basic idle of your engine can, once you start to engage and you're participating, is your engine matching just right? Or is it a little too low or a little too fast? And so on some level, arousal, we can think about arousal that way, that you have this kind of match of energy that is it about right for what's called for in the situation, or is it a little too high or a little too low? And that would be the baseline of arousal, so that your baseline of arousal either runs a little low or it runs a little high, or it tends to run just the way that it should run. And that running just the way that it should run isn't a steady state, right? It's adjusting. So sometimes I'm going 50 miles an hour down the road because it's a highway and I should go that fast. And then sometimes I should go 10 miles an hour because I'm in the school zone and I want to be super careful. So just right doesn't mean one thing. It means that I adjust and match what's going on around. So that on some level is kind of the simplest way to think about arousal. But within that, you have all these dials going on, right? So in order to know that I'm going 10 miles an hour in the speed limit for the children's school zone, I have to dial down my thinking about the stress at work and my grocery list and what I'm going to do over the weekend, so I can pay attention that the children are not going to get run over by my car. And so my attention has to get dialed in to my arousal state if I'm going to do a really good job of being a driver. Or let's say that I want to do a really good job of driving that car, but now I've never driven a stick shift before, and and I'm really thinking about my motor plan. So now I'm dialing into my attention, make sure I don't run over the children and go the right speed, and also control my limb as I'm shifting the thing. So now the brain is more working harder. And the more that it has to think about shifting the gears, the harder it's going to be for it to keep it at 10 miles per hour.
Yes.
Because of the simultaneous processing that's happening. So state is actually all of that. And that's why it's so complicated.
And is that, I'm taking a leap now, but some of our kiddos, and I guess for you, that some days, if we've had a hectic day at work, or you're like Corey and you're moving and you've got lots going on, is that I'm like, I'm going to avoid the schools today. That was too hard on my brain. That was too taxing. That took too much of my attention and required too much energy for me to manage that safely today. I'm going around the schools today. And I guess that's what we see kids do, is when they're having a tricky time managing their state, that they get sticky about where they're going to go and what they're going to do, that they want to avoid those tricky times, and they'll take an alternate route or get lots of rules about, I'm going to go past the school, but we can't have the music on, kids, nobody talking, and I'm actually not going to change gears. I'm just going to idle past there to minimise in second. And I hope the
That's
lollipop.
Exactly right. Yeah. So you know what you just did, Michelle, was you connected the whole conversation to the higher level capacity that sensory modulation fuels, and that's what we call self-regulation. So self-regulation is that adaptability that we all have to make those decisions, like, ooh, that's not comfortable, I'm just not going to do that. But what can happen in a nervous system that doesn't function well is that isn't a volitional decision. Yeah, it happens to you. So my nervous system is so overloaded by sound that I can't leave my house.
Mm-hmm. So and you can't you can't come up with an adaptive strategy to work around the discomfort of loud sound.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So can I come back to the separating state from arousal piece? So in the example we were talking about driving the car, so arousal is just how able I am to sort of move my attention and hold myself in the place that I need to be paying attention to. Is that what you? So like, I needed to pay attention to the fact that it's changed to I'm just going to say 40 k's an hour because it's a school zone, and that if I can do that, then I'm managing my arousal in that moment, despite potential stresses about, I don't know, I need to pick up my child or something else is going on. So I can manage my arousal to stay tuned into the fact that it's 40k and I can do that. Whereas state is, let me see if I can put it together. So now you've amped the task up and I have to drive my manual car and I have to think about there's a lollipop man there and I need to stop and I have not driven stick before and I need to change it. So now the arousal piece is the fact that I could stay with the task, but now that there's simultaneous processing of multiple things, my state has shifted up, or like, how am I describing that? How should I put that together?
Yeah. So I think that is how you put it together, but part of it is that we try to put, 18 different processes into one word or one concept. And so that starts to fall a little short. So when we dive into training people, I guess therapists especially, to do clinical reasoning on this, what happens is that we start with the base of neuroception. What are those valences looking like? And then what does that window of arousal look like around that? And then when you start to bump into the edges of functioning, what's the impact of that on all of the arousal functions? And so the arousal functions are what we're kind of alluding to here. We've talked about attention. We've talked about action regulation, kind of managing the stick shift and figuring out how hard or soft to push the brake. But there are other functions. So there's emotionality, affective processing that's highly involved here. And then again, those autonomic functions. So those we call those the A's of infancy. Lester and Tronick named it that. But there are these A functions that are all related to the regulatory capacity. And those are informed by sensory modulation. And then you have that arousal state that's not just arousal, it's all of the A's together. So arousal is one and state is all.
Okay.
Got it.
Does that help?
I think that might help me a bit. So I think you were talking about just in one moment you were talking about the optimal range of arousal, right? So there's a range there. So if I have good capacities in my system to tolerate a number of things at once, then I can maintain an optimal range of arousal with a lot of load. Is that right? Whereas once I hit the edges, so of the edges of my optimal, so if I start to get too activated or too aroused and there's too much load, then I'm shifting into a different state of nervous system. I don't know, is that right?
Yeah, sure. Then you're not as adaptive. And so then what happens is that the system has to start to tell you, wait a second, you need to reduce stimulation. Maybe it's the sensation that's too much for you. So if you dial down the sensation, maybe then you can hang in there with your arousal.
Yeah.
Or maybe you need to dial down your language processing. Or maybe you need to dial down your attention. Or maybe you need to dial down one of the other A's. Yeah. And so it's a very dynamic, very complicated process. And what happens to our kids is what you see in them is in an optimal state of arousal, everything kind of works, right? Their sensory responses look really great. Their safety and engagement looks awesome. Their attention is good. Their affect is great. Their action regulation is really spot on. And then when you start to, so this system works as a constraint. It's a narrowing window. That's why we call it the window of tolerance. So as that window narrows down, it's more likely you're going to bump the edges. And as you bump those edges in our kids, what you see is inattention, hyperactivity, action dysregulation, fear, fight, or flight responding, You see them get antsy and agitated. You see them get uncomfortable in their own skin. You see them over responding to every little sound around them. You see them hiding. You see them seeking comfort. You see them dodging out of situations. You see all kinds of different ways of coping, but it's because that window got narrow and they can't handle it. So as the window opens up, then you see, oh, this return to adaptability. And the window narrows down, and you see bumpy edges, and you see chaos and rigidity, and a lack of flow, a lack of integration, a lack of regulation. So we just say dysregulation. But dysregulation isn't one thing. It's all of that whole cacophony that I just started to start to label. And you just see this lack of integration. So what is it that, Dan Siegel talks about? The flow of integration gives you regulation. Regulation gives you integration. It's the back and forth relationship between those two things. And that's why we end up treating it, because we're treating problems of integration.
Oh, that's so wonderful, Tracy. There is so much to get our head around. I guess when I have a kiddo in the clinic, what I really start to do is draw on the first thing I do. Actually, I do it when I look at all the people in all the world now, is that concept that you had in the Step SI, where I literally draw an L. And on that axis going up, I'm not very good at my maths. What goes up? The vertical is the state. So I really look at down low. I'll if they're got a lower state of regulation, then I will just do a line across down low, so that when a kiddo comes in, that's really what I'm looking at what state. And not just one time. So over the course of a few, because sometimes it's variable when the kids come in. Some kiddos are lower in their state because of a new environment. But I really am tracking where is their base state, and then I'm looking at their sensation, I guess specifically their processing and modulation of sensation. So I'm noticing how they process sound, taste, smell, vestibular input, prope input. So I'm really noticing what might they be defensive of. So auditory defensive, for example, and that's cueing them not to be safe. And then I'll be looking at what their range of what they tolerate, so that window of tolerance. And I'll literally draw two lines across. I use them in dotted lines where it's really like, well, this is their window of tolerance. They're really narrow, and I'll make mention of, auditory input, tactile input is a cues them to be feeling not safe, so a threat, and it promotes that or activates that defensive pattern. And their particular profile is to mobilize into a flee state, and they'll run. So each time I'm seeing a new child, and really every session and throughout the session, I'm really just checking in my mind state, sensory modulation, and their adaptive, and what might push them out of being adaptive. So is that how you do it on a really practical level?
Yeah, that's so exactly spot on. And that, I think, is clinical reasoning around sensory modulation and regulation in a nutshell. And that's what we have really on the left-hand side of the handout, is an opportunity to use a sketch pad to draw out that L-shaped bar graph that captures for us arousal state across time, how wide or narrow the window of tolerance is, where it's located, and then what happens when the kid bumps those edges. And really the thing that's interesting about this is that we have assessments for the problems of adaptation, like anxiety or attention problems. We can get a sense of over and under responding on some assessment tools. We can get a sense of defensive responding and variable responding but there isn't really a whole comprehensive assessment that tells us all of what we need to know. So the only way we can do it is by what you're doing, which is to draw it out, gather that information, and track it across time and circumstance to really get a sense of the dynamics of this complicated system. So I love that you're doing that. And I think it really, so as you've done that, Michelle, how did it change your clinical practice to do that, to insert that process in your thinking?
It is the information that allows me really to, in the moment, decide what to do. So from moment to moment, I guess what I feel like I'm gathering is this massive info bank about what is supporting the child and what might be really a signal of threat for the child. And so that when that happens, I'm noticing, oh, that was a little flea, mobilized response. Were my eyebrows too big? Was my laugh too big? Did I play too big? Did that, so I'm just really marking down what was the impact, what was the input that was dysregulating for them. And so I'll note that, and then I'll note the things that signal safety for them, so that I'll help them recover by for example, if they've got affect dysregulation, that I might lower me or just have a softer face and speak with prosody. So I'm signaling safety to help them, I guess, to signal that I'm ready for them to return, so that when they're ready, they'll come on. So it's really helping me work out what state they're in and what we can do in the session. And if their state, if they're a little dysregulated and that looks a bit fragile, then I'm really going to work on regulation first. And I'm going, from all that information that I've gathered, that I'm using the things that I know support their regulation, so that they come back into that better state of regulation. And I guess as time goes by, when I want to expand their tolerance, is I'm going to bump up to the edge of that top window of tolerance and then offer some support, so they're hitting it, feeling a bit fragile, but hopefully coming back into that regulated state again, so that they're, over time, by bumping into that top edge of their tolerance, widening it over time.
Yeah,
that cool. Is so beautifully described. And I think it's essential, because the treatment requires that we bump into those edges adaptively, and that we resource the child to be able to have an adaptive response to those edges and that's how you build resiliency. That's how you build that window of tolerance. It's how you expand it. And if you don't have that visual image of what it is that you're doing in treatment, I don't even really actually know. I think you end up doing very formulaic treatment that doesn't spot on really build the capacity. And so I love that you're doing that. And I know, Corey, you do the same. I mean, I've seen you treat where I can you're so present with the children, but I can see you almost picturing that window of tolerance and thinking about it.
100%. And when you were talking about just Michelle in your treatment, like so many things coming to my mind around, there's the modulation piece of the actual sensations that are coming in. But as soon as you start to think about whether the child perceives they're in a safe space or whether they perceive that this is too much, it's fascinating how much that changes what they can actually process and organize. So, if you picture that XY axis graph and you have their range, at any moment in the session, you can see the range narrow down, depending on like what's going on and what demand you're putting on that child. And so I think it's fascinating, like if I'm doing a task and I've just loaded up the motor system, or I've loaded them up in a language. I've given them too much language and I see it narrow down and I see them mobilize away, or they're no longer adaptive. And I think that was the cool thing that you said, Tracy, was we hit the edges adaptively, so that it's, for me, that brought up that comment that you had around volitional response rather than reactive, because that's what we're looking for, because all the time these kids are reactively responding rather than hitting the edge and then adaptively, volitionally having an adaptive response. They're just kind of controlled by the nervous system. So that's the treatment. And gosh, is that hard to explain to a parent. And so I'm always using that graph to help explain that concept. Because in treatment, it requires such sophisticated, ability to go with what you see in the moment, but have the knowledge around why you're seeing that in the moment too. So, yes.
I explain this to every single, I was going to say carer, but I actually talk about this to anybody who will listen because it helps decide what you're going to do. So if I see a little kiddo, so parents can start to see their child through this lens, I guess, and make decisions about, are they even going to have a big hello, how's your day, darling, when the child jumps in the car? Because if you see them literally, their state is really activated, so their body's really upright, their face is really stern, there's no eye contact to the carer, you can see that they're loaded. So talking about, how's your day, dear, how's your maths assignment, we've got to go to Woolies to pick up some avocados. Yeah. That is going to be a source of stress for that child. And so you choose not to do that if you possibly can.
Yeah. If the window's already narrow, don't add any more load. I think that makes me think about what Tracy says to us all the time, which is regulation is the basis for everything.
Absolutely.
If you're not regulated, then what you can't really add more anything. And so sometimes that's like trying to highlight that to parents just so that they know what I'm trying to do, because I need to get them first. I need to get them regulated. I can't ask any more of them at this point in time because they're not in that state. They're not in that range.
And sometimes that can take multiple treatment sessions to work out what that actually is. Is it a fort where they literally have this safe nest that they, physically have a sense of safety? Is it music? Is it affect? Is it no task at all other than just rhythm and,
Is it visual containment? Do I have to get into a small space with this child? But
because we're so greedy, and we know that this neurological change only happens once we've got them regulated, but then to expand them, we actually have to start challenging them. Yeah. So then I get really greedy because it was like, right, I feel like I've got your recipe for perceiving safety and
into your optimal.
I know what all your dials are, buddy. So then I start messing with them and think, right, I'm going to put the noise, the loud up. All due respect, I don't mess with people's brains. No. But that you'll start if that auditory input is difficult, I'll start amping them up when I see them regulated. It's like, right, well, now we need to start providing all the cues of safety, layering that on, but adding the source.
Helping you be adaptive. Yeah.
Precisely. You guys rock. I love it. I'm so proud.
Yay! We love these discussions.
You taught me all this, Tracy.
Yeah.
I've got to say, oh my gosh, I don't want to tell you how many hundreds of dollars of books.
Oh,
it's really hard to get your head around this work. Theoretically, I guess, and then having them align because the language is different depending if it's neuroscience, psychology, there's all the sections come at it with different language. So then to merge them, but bring them into the OT language, in my experience, yes, there's been some early people like Ez, How Did Your Engine Run? Like we did that. I probably got the car idea from them, so I'm sorry if I didn't credit them probably. And you, Tracy, you've allowed me to make sense of that in the OT sense, I guess, and then add in all the elements that we know so well, which is sensation, I guess, is motor planning, is relationship.
Yes.
So thank you, Tracy, and all the forerunners for bringing this and making it so accessible for OT.
And listeners didn't know this, but that bar graph chart that Tracy does where she maps out a child's state and their window and how they bump the edges and what narrows that. She's been doing that for like how long, Tracy? Since the 90s. How long have you been?
Yeah, so in the STEP SI, Julie Wilbarger first made this graph way back in 1991 that was just an arousal graph related to sensory processing, really sensory response and recovery, which is the definition of, on some level, the definition of modulation. And so we included it in the STEP SI when we were figuring out how to treat sensory modulation disorders. We said, you have to make this graph to figure out your clinical reasoning because there's no assessment. So this is our only way forward. And then, a few years later, the concept of the window of tolerance became a concept in the psychology and psychiatry literature from Dan Siegel and Pat Ogden in 2006. She really, popularized that. But I think it's not theirs. It really comes from the Yerkes-Dodson principle, which goes all the way back to the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So these are not new concepts, but the way we conceptualize them in our OT literature really takes sensory modulation to a whole new level.
Yeah.
And that's what we need for treatment, because it isn't just the sensation, it's sensation for the purpose of.
Yeah.
So sensory modulation is for the purpose of regulation.
Yeah.
And regulation is for the purpose of adaptive self-regulation.
Yes. Cool.
Oh, thanks so much, Tracy. Gosh, I learn something every time we talk about this. So we will wrap that up now. I think for the moment we could go on for hours. You know that, don't you? So we will come at this in the next episode. We'll have a more practical application of this and really extend it into intervention planning. I think today my takeaway is that in trying to get my head around, or theorists trying to get their head around particular phenomena or elements, we dive into things and look at it quite isolated maybe and separately, and that, like we know with all the other systems in the brain, that it really is very, very integrated, and that sensory modulation is no different, that it really is a very integrated and connected part of regulation, and they don't stand alone.
Cool. Mine is probably from today. Was I'd never really separated state from arousal before, and just even thinking about arousal, knowing now that there's so many pieces, like it's so complicated. I knew that already, but it just really highlighted for me how complicated it is. And so my key takeaway is I'm going to go in and dig into that because it's complex and I want to get my head around it. So I'm keen to go and figure out how these elements are all different. But yeah, that's it for me today.
Oh, wow. That was another beauty, Trace. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
great
much.
Conversation, you guys. Thank you so much for, just the great conversation. And I look forward to deepening it next time. Yeah, great.
See you then.
See you.
Bye. This podcast is brought to you by Seed Pediatric Services and Developmental FX, produced by Little Image Co. For more information, please go to our show notes on our website, spiritedconversationspodcast.com, or catch us at our Seed and Developmental FX Facebook or Insta pages. So grateful to have you with us today for this episode. Take care, and we'll see you next time.